Some philosophical arguments are just a cut above the rest, and one of these is Mary's room. Now, normally I'd go into why this argument is so good, but do I really need to? I mean, oh my god. No, I'll give some context first. So, in 1981, the chair of philosophy at Monash University, Frank Jackson, was discovered by some of his colleagues to be a dualist. Now, this was rather scandalous at the time, because by far the most popular view among people educated on the topic of philosophy of mind was just physicalism about consciousness. Now, because of how shocked they were, they actually asked Frank Jackson to give a talk about why he was a dualist, and he thought about it for a while, and then he eventually agreed. The stage was set. For a while, he couldn't figure out how to convey his ideas. Then, after weeks of deliberation, he finally came up with the thought experiment that would go down as one of the most famous in history. Due to the wild success of his talk among both popular and academic audiences alike, he finally put pen to paper, and that's where the argument begins.
Mary is a brilliant scientist who has been studying everything there is to know about the physical process of color perception.
This poor woman is stuck in a room, which is all black and white, and she only sees black and white television, and she never sees a chromatic color in her life.
And then she gets the whole physical story, all the details. We credit her with enormous intelligence, unbelievable ability to put things together.
And then she stepped out of the room. Once she leaves her black and white room for the first time, would she learn anything new? Of course she would.
For the first time, she knows what red is. She's learned something new, but she knew all the physical facts about color. So it must be a non-physical fact.
Okay, that's the argument. Got it?
So why then, if this argument has influenced so many people, does the creator of this thought experiment himself, Frank Jackson, now reject it? Well, that's what we're here to look at. In 1998, in his book Mind, Method, and Conditionals, Frank Jackson, out of nowhere seemingly, just switched sides in this consciousness debate. Needless to say, this caused massive amounts of controversy, more essays, literary references, and news articles. Because just 12 years ago, the fact is he was the leading proponent and author of this argument. So how can we know why he switched sides? Well, let's read the paper. Jackson begins in his paper Postscript on Qualia. He outlines a common concept that almost everyone is familiar with. So he introduces the at-at theory of motion, which is just a theory of motion in which the motion of an object is, at least in principle, reducible to that object's positions at the times which it is at each of those positions. So, for example, if I took this card, and this card moved from here to here, the motion of this object was it going from this position at time t2, and it came there from this position at time t1. So the change in time and change in distance, kind of slope of a graph, if you want to think about it that way. And that's the at theory of motion. And he says, what we talk about when we are talking about motion is unclear. How we actually, like, I could say, oh, that dog moved. When we're using this term motion in a colloquial sense, there is no clear definition, metaphysically or even just through the nature of physics, about what we actually mean. But most people just generally mean it to mean, oh, this thing went from one place to another. No clear definition there. However, there are competing theories for what motion is, or at least at this time. People could think that there is a intrinsic property of this same card when it's moving. So its motion is composed not just of its moving from here to here, but it has a property called motion, or whatever you want to call it, and that is actually necessary for it to move, or for its movement from one place to another to actually be considered motion. Now, Jackson says this is an empirical claim about the way the world is. If this property, we'll call it C, exists, then C is necessary for motion to exist. If we're talking about just the at theory of motion, that is not a complete description of what motion metaphysically would be defined as. But if this property C did not exist, then the at theory of motion seems to be true. Then he says quite plausibly, I think, whether you could deduce all that there is about an object's motion, again, quite nebulous term there, would depend on whether this property C would exist. And it's empirical claim about our world, not about how we conceptually analyze motion itself. He then likens this to qualia, saying in some worlds, perhaps the redness of our reds is not deducible in principle from just purely physical facts, but in ours, it is. Now, in these possible worlds, conscious experience would be dualist in nature, and qualia would be too. Now, possible worlds doesn't just mean theories by metaphysical theories. It just doesn't mean, like, I could produce a theory that the moon is made of cheese, but it seems at least that in no world is this metaphysically possible. It seems importantly different than the moon perhaps being 1 meter cubed greater in volume. That is a metaphysically possible claim, or it could be possible in some world that is true, but not the moon would be made out of cheese. And then he makes a very strong claim that in our world, it is not dualist in nature. He says the redness of our reds is deducible just from physical facts about the world. This is what he's going to defend, and also he says he's going to defend against a very strong intuition that this claim is false. So he begins by saying that our knowledge of the sensory side of psychology, or our own conscious experience, actually has a causal impact, right? This doesn't just spring up ex nihilo. When we see red and feel pain, this gives us a memory, or he calls a false memory trace. We can know what feeling pain and seeing red are like even when we're not currently doing so, which is a decent chunk of the time. And this is because we have this memory. We have this thing that sustains our knowledge of what it is like to have these qualia. He then says this is actually places a constraint upon our opinions about the nature of qualia. We can't just say that, oh, you can only know what these things are like if you're currently experiencing them, because clearly that is false. In fact, he basically applies Occam's razor to these opinions. He says you should not, at least, have opinions that are not justified by the best theory of the causal origins of those opinions. So, this is where, when I was studying this, it gets into the weeds a bit here, because there are quite a few ways you can interpret this maxim, and how you do so will determine if you strawman him or not, which, I mean, hopefully I will not do here. Yeah. So one way that I interpreted this maxim, and I believe I was wrong in doing so, it actually is pretty close to the way that I think he intended to use it, but basically I thought he was saying the mental processes in your brain that effectively cause your opinion. Now, this is wrong, and this would clearly be easily objectionable. Okay, but if he was using the second way, then it would be, okay, so your eyes process certain information, that's physical, and then it sends it to your retina, that's physical, through your cortex, that's physical, to rays and to cones and rods, that's physical, and all the way down, we can keep going through all of these physically describable processes. Does that then follow that what they learn is physical? No. So, you have to be careful not to strawman him here, which I did for about 4 weeks. So hopefully I can get over that now. Jesus, hot. Oh my gosh. So, no, he's actually, he's talking about this, but he's talking about evidence in a broader sense. He's not just talking about the mental processes or even physical processes that lead to you having an opinion. No, he's talking about all of the things that can be taken as evidence for your opinion. So causes in the broader sense, not just like you understand what I mean. How he says because we can explain Mary's coming to know what it is like to see red in fully physical terms. Say like we can explain her changing brain states between the brain state of not having seen red and having seen red. We can explain that in physical terms, all these other things in purely physical terms. Kind of by this and kind of applying Occam's razor here, we shouldn't posit that what she actually learns is non-physical. Now, this is for a very specific reason. It doesn't seem to follow, but he's using Occam's razor in a kind of different way here. So he's taking dualist interactionism to be false. Now, if you don't know what this is, don't worry. Now, dualists basically say there's a stuff. Mind, which its very essence is to be intentional about stuff, to think conscious experiences, but it's not in space. And there's a stuff, the body, which is spatial, can touch, I can move stuff around, yeah. And these are two separate things. And Jackson is saying, okay, the mind can't interact with the body. The mind can't cause the body to do stuff because the mind isn't in space. It has no spatial extension, and the body does. And so in order for two things in physics to interact, They must both be within space. The mind isn't, therefore the mind can't cause the body to do something. This is actually quite a popular view. Jackson held it when he was still a dualist. His paper is called Epiphenomenal Qualia, that first put out this thought experiment of Mary's room, which means the qualia, the mental conscious experiences, don't cause your body to do anything. That's the very name of his original paper. So yeah, this is quite a popular view. And this naturally leads to another view called physical closure, which means we can explain every event, at least in theory, in purely physical terms. And because this is true, he says we can just explain Mary's coming to know what red is like in physical terms. Now, this seems like it wouldn't bear much on what she actually knows. If we have these two options, we have either what she knows is physical, or either maybe what she knows is not physical, and we can explain everything else physically, including all of the steps that it takes for her to learn this new thing. And if the only reason we have for thinking what she learned is non-physical is an intuition, then he's saying we should use Occam's razor here. If we posit a non-physical thing, we have multiplied entities very unnecessarily. There's a million new things, like redness, that we now have to admit maybe into our ontology, our lists of what exists. And he says, why should we do this? Well, maybe the only reason is this intuition, which he's going to combat, and I'll try to present his views of combating it later in this video and in that paper. Now, how does this tie into his maxim? Remember, don't have opinions that go beyond what is justified by the best theory of those opinions' causal origins. So here, he's talking about the opinion that Mary learned something non-physical, or what Mary learned was non-physical. Now, what is that opinion's causal origins? Well, it seems to be, if physical closure is true, only physical stuff. Does all the physical stuff, physical processes that led to me supposedly having this opinion by this maxim and the thing I just went over just previously, does that seem to lend itself to thinking that what Mary learned was non-physical? Well, no. At least not if we have no evidence for thinking that what Mary learned was non-physical. However, an epiphenomenalist dualist will say, yes, we do. We have our own qualia. At least I'm not a solipsist. I assume you are also having a conscious experience. We both have our own evidence for thinking what Mary learned was non-physical. Namely, what seems to be this non-physical conscious experience we are each having. Now, this is where Jackson gets even more into the weeds here. He says, yes, but this is not evidence for our opinion that what Mary learned was non-physical. Now, why on earth would this be? Well, remember, both of these people agree that our non-physical qualia, in theory, if they existed, which they disagree on that point, but if they existed, they would not be causing our opinion. Remember, they don't cause anything related to our body, including my expressing of this opinion, or say, Jackson's hand in writing that essay. They're not causing their expression of that opinion. And because they don't cause it, well, the maxim says they shouldn't be evidence for it. Now, the epiphenomenalist dualist will obviously want to object here, because if this is true, then dualism is, at least in principle, a little bit of a rough spot. So, Jackson provides the newspaper analogy, one that he himself, back in 1982, provided. He says, well, if an earthquake occurs, and newspaper A reports on it, they write a paper on it, would that be evidence for newspaper B writing a paper on it? Well, clearly, yeah, clearly that would. But did newspaper A then, by the maxim's logic, cause newspaper B to, happen? Did the person writing newspaper A say, oh, once I write this, immediately newspaper B will be written? No, just the way newspapers work, we know newspaper A most likely did not cause newspaper B to be written. So it seems like the epiphenomenalist dualist, or I'll just call it ED from now on, has landed a point here. The ED has said, okay, look, well, nice in theory, but clearly things can be evidence for another thing without them actually being directly causally related. Jackson says, okay, well, look at what you just did again. Just look back at it a second. The reason that one newspaper is evidence for another isn't simply because they have a common cause, but because of what you know about newspapers and because of how they impact you in the everyday life. You know from experience that newspapers often post similar articles on significant events and record those events pretty reliably. For example, if the United States won the World Cup, you would think that a few newspapers would post on this. They would write articles on this, and they would do so somewhat reliably because of the way that newspapers work and how you experience them in your everyday life. So, if the ED wants to use this analogy as evidence for the fact that things don't need to be directly causally connected to be evidence for one another, well, then they need to show that these things track over too. So Jackson's asking the question of the dualist, well, are your qualia actually reliably reporting and significant events? The ED will say, well, yeah, they are. If I put my hand in a frying pan 5 times, all 5 times I'm going to get a very similar quail, or singular form of qualia. It's going to be painful. I'm going to experience that painful quail. Jackson says, okay, sure, good point. But just imagine for a second that they weren't tracking, reliably at least, physical events. Imagine you're hallucinating that there's this frying pan here. You didn't ever put your hand in a frying pan. Maybe you're dreaming about this, but you still have this pain quail. Well, if these qualia then aren't tracking physical events, then would that then be evidence for your conclusion that what Mary learned was something new? Well, says the ED, no, it wouldn't, but they are. I just told you that they were. Jackson, once again, says, hold up, not so fast. So if you have these qualia without physical events to support them, they're not reliably tracking them. But if you have the physical events without the qualia, then you don't get the evidence that you want. So you need both. So the qualia is meaningless by itself. What you're really depending on here is the physical event. The qualia isn't doing any explanatory work. It's only physical events. So why posit these qualia at all? And then he says the most fundamental point is that things have to be causally connected in the relevant sense for them to be evidence for your opinions, namely the dualist opinion that Mary has learned something new and non-physical. Jackson then turns to the last thing seemed to be going for dualism here, the very strong intuition that Mary learned something new and seemingly how the argument is put, non-physical. Now it's important to note here that Jackson is a representationalist. He's also an identity theorist. So that means that he thinks, first, identity theory is that mental states are equivalent, they're equal to conscious experience. My mental state A is the exact same thing as conscious state A or conscious state B. It is not mental state A and I experience that mental state. There's no I. It's the exact same thing. And representationalism is that these mental states that are our conscious experiences are representing certain facts about the way the world is around us. So when I see red, for example, it is representing the reflectance profile of this shirt, which I'm assuming you're seeing is red. Maybe the distance from your eye that shirt is, the way that the sunlight is hitting it. All these things will perhaps change your experience of that red. Okay, now that you've got these terms defined, let's go into his analogy. He says, if you wanted to guess what the weather in Chicago will be when you get out of your flight, well, this is relational information. It is the weather in Chicago, and if it's going to be better than when you were there last time, or the weather last week, these are all one thing in relation to another. This is relational information. And to get this relational information, say, weather in Chicago, once you get out of your plane, you need to do some experimentation, or maybe research. You need to look what the weather is going to be, what the weather forecast is, what the weather was last time, what the humidity levels are and are predicted to be. Like all these different things, this takes effort to get this relational information. However, remember, Jackson is a representationalist. He believes our mental state are representing relational and functional information about the way the world is around us. So it's when we experience seeing red. We're not related with an intrinsic property of some redness, that is, some you are just floating. He doesn't know where. He thinks, again, Occam's razor, just rule that out. He says, no, except, we're not actually experiencing some property, redness. We are seeing the reflectance all these things. And our brain is representing that as the color red. Now, if representationalism in the way he's presenting is correct, and we're just being represented information as a conscious experience about highly relational and functional facts about the way the world is, then we are getting this in a very unusual manner. As you showed with the weather example, relational and functional information takes a long time to get, or at least a few seconds at the very least. And this seemingly instant experience we get of seeing red and blue and yellow, that is so strange and unique in the way that we get that. And so it seems like we don't have time to be experimenting, at least not consciously, maybe not even unconsciously. It seems like we're experiencing an intrinsic property of this redness or blueness or yellowness. And this is why it seems like visual conscious experience is a relation with how that object actually is, and there's something more than physical going on here. And then he just ends with some concerns about whether we can actually know the real, like, intrinsic nature of the world, how physics only describes things in terms of their function, like a chess rules only describe the king in how it can move and what happens when it gets checked or how you lose the game, not that it's made out of wood or stone or glass. And that's kind of what physics is. Then he says he wants to reject this on Occam's grounds. Also, the guy that made Occam's razor is just saying, no, it's more likely that we're like relating to actual properties of the way the world is and how the world actually is. He just goes on the spiel about how Mary is gonna be like never really possible and we're not gonna know a lot about her. But yeah, that's essentially his argument. Now, it has been criticized by many duelists, and it's interesting. A lot of people don't understand them, including me, fully, at least up until probably a few days ago. And a lot of people do and still criticize him. It's a very polarizing issue. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I completely butchered it and I still don't understand him. And yeah, like, sub if you want. Thanks for watching.